Cornell, she went to MIT, Harvard, but the most important thing is that from then on the story is known. Her work has been fundamental in defining, in shaping the way we psychology, our field, thinks about how babies, infants think, and how cognition unfolds both ontogenetically but also in a way phylogenetically. She has beautiful experimental work in infants, and has led to proposals that are, I think, that run across many of our fields and are fundamental or central to the way we think about cognition. And particularly, she proposed a set of innate domain-specific core knowledge systems, potentially interesting also at a time that Piaget was, the dominant figure, and his theory was a dominant theory. And so the idea of innate core knowledge systems really challenged a more of open slate idea. Interestingly enough, she's also going to talk about how these core systems interact with learning, and how children learn. And so, as I was saying, I think this makes her the perfect keynote speaker, both for our association, because her experimental work is really beautiful, but also to this first Mind-Brain lecture, where in a project where we're trying to show that fundamental science, fundamental psychology is, at least can be, and probably should be, a way of, or a source of information of how we should do applied psychology. And so a lot of what she's going to talk to, part of what she's going to talk today, relates to this idea of, this fundamental knowledge, this fundamental research on innate core systems can then help us understand how children learn and potentially help us work on how we can intervene in learning and education. Without any further ado, Liz, thank you very much for accepting our invitation. It's a great pleasure to have you here, and the floor is yours.
Thanks so much, George. There's one minor technical detail we did not discuss in advance, which is how do we get my talk off my Mac? Or can I use the Mac?
Yeah, you can use the Mac. Oh, it's here?
It's here. Well, yeah, I brought my computer. Thank you, everybody. It's really a great pleasure to be here in this beautiful place with all this beautiful science that's going on. Now all we need is a little technology to cooperate, and we'll be good to go. Thank you. Let's see. Actually, I better get to the beginning of the talk before we do that. Oops, where did it go? There was a problem with Microsoft PowerPoint, and we apologize. Let's try this again. Oh, it's not on? Okay, it's on my computer.
Great, done.
Yay, okay. Let me see, can I get this out of the way? Okay, you can all hear me? Fine, okay. So I don't think I need to tell you that, especially here in a building devoted to psychology and education, that children are prodigious learners. Before they get to school, they develop a basic common sense understanding of the world that encompasses everything from the language that the people around them speak to the physical, geographical, spatial layout of their environment, to the social environment they're in, the people in their world and the relationships among them, the forms and functions of objects, and a whole host of customs and skills that they observe in the people around them and come to take on themselves without anybody explicitly usually teaching them to do so. And then, around the age of 6 or so, something really strange happens. These kids who've been wandering around the world and spontaneously learning find themselves in classrooms where, instead of learning from direct experience with people that you know well, who you're living with and talking to and so forth, they start learning about worlds beyond immediate perception through the information that they get from teachers and the educational materials that they're using. And with this, they gain a host of new skills, most notably reading and mathematics. They master new symbols, they learn new concepts, and they come to learn whole new disciplines for capturing abstract fundamental properties of the world beyond perception. Now, no other animal manages to do this, and it raises the question, how do children meet these challenges? How do children learn? Now, this is obviously an open question. It's been extensively debated. There's many proposals that have been made, including that children's learning capacities are just an emerging phenomenon from their our increasingly large brains or our prolonged immaturity to the notions that we have special circuitry in the brain or species unique talents and propensities, and there people have suggested different things, including propensities for communicating or using symbols or inventing tools or creating complex social relationships. But what I want to do today, as George said, is to suggest an approach to this question that relies on 7 different cognitive systems. 6 systems of what I call core knowledge that I believe guide our reasoning and learning about the world at all ages, including at the beginning of life. And second, our human capacity for learning language, and as we learn it, for using language to learn about the world. And I'll try to illustrate this by focusing on 3 different examples of learning, one by infants, one by toddlers, and one by children in school. So what's core knowledge? Well, it's a set of systems for capturing highly important entities that populate every human environment, including manipulable inanimate objects, places that you can navigate to, geometric forms that can be used both for making symbols and for decorations of all kinds, and also for capturing the shapes of objects, a system for representing number, and 2 systems for representing people, one as social beings who engage with each other, and the other as agents who cause their own motions and by moving cause changes in the world. Now, I think each of these systems centers on distinct abstract concepts, concepts that are abstract enough to be applicable to all environments. For example, in all environments, for animals at a variety of different sizes and for people at a variety of different ages, there are objects that are internally cohesive, that can move from one place to another, and that are solid, such that 2 things can't be in the same place at once. These are highly abstract properties that will be true of any environment that a child could be born into. Another property of these systems is that they solve different problems with different distinctive limits. For example, the problem of representing where objects are is solved by an infant by analyzing patterns of object motion through visual scenes or the scenes that they explore with their hands, but not by analyzing many other properties that we'll use as adults, such as gestalt properties, the simplicity of an object's shape. Now, if you put together the properties that characterize the abstract systems we find in infants with the limits to those systems, you get a set of signatures of each of these systems that allow us to ask some interesting questions that can lead to useful further research. So one question is, are these systems unique to humans, or are they shared by other animals? The answer turns out to be that you see this evidence for the same systems where this has been tested, which it has been in monkeys and rodents and birds. I'll give you some examples from birds. You find that these are shared by diverse other animals. And that's very useful because when you find these systems in other animals, you now can run experiments on animals that would be ethically or practically impossible with humans. For example, you can do controlled rearing experiments where you rear an animal with no exposure, for example, to objects, and see what they end up representing. And when you do this, you find evidence that where this has been tested, that each of these systems is innate. And by that I mean that it develops spontaneously in anticipation of the entities to which it applies. It's not, if it were learned, it would be shaped by those entities, but these are systems that are there and ready to go. Partly solving the problem of what makes children such great learners because they don't need to learn everything. They have systems that capture the most abstract properties of 6 different kinds of entities. Now, the same logic that lets you use these signatures to test for the existence of these systems in other animals also allows you to use it to test for the existence of these systems at different ages in humans. You can ask, are these systems scaffolding that our species has discovered and uses just to get learning off the ground? Or are they systems that continue to function in us all of our lives and guide our thinking and our reasoning? And the evidence suggests that the latter is the case. That is that core knowledge never goes away. We find it in children guiding their reasoning. We find it in evidence for it in adults as well. And that also is useful because you can do things in experiments on adults that are very hard to do with young kids or impossible to do with infants, like ask them, what are you experiencing while you're engaged in a task that's activating your systems of core knowledge? And when you ask adults that question, the answer tends to be, they are not thinking about the activity of this system at all. Rather, these systems are unconscious. They operate automatically under appropriate perceptual conditions. They'll be activated and they'll function completely and will be completely oblivious to their existence. But although adults and children are oblivious to their existence, there's evidence that they guide children's learning. And I'll give you some examples of that as we go along. So let me start by introducing you to 2 systems to give you a feel for the kind of research that underlies these claims that I'm making. And let me start with research on newborn infants and probing their knowledge of objects. So very simple studies have been done with newborn infants using the fact that although a newborn infant can hardly do anything, one thing that they can do is look around at things, and they will tend to look at things that could potentially provide them with more information, look at things when they change or when something new appears. And so this method has been used in babies in maternity hospitals aged 1 to 3 days to ask whether when babies are presented with an object that's partly hidden but partly visible, does their representation of that object go beyond the parts of it that are visible? And the answer is yes, because after familiarization with a partly hidden object, if the object that's hiding it is taken away, they look longer if there's a gap there corresponding to the visible surfaces that they'd been seeing before than if there's a connected object there, showing that they're extrapolating a connected object behind that occluder. At 3 months, the same logic provides evidence that infants represent objects when they move fully out of view and expect objects to be solid, such that a screen that's rotating towards an object will stop when it gets to it, and they look longer at events that violate that expectation. And another month later, there's evidence that if babies see an object that moves successively behind 2 occluders, disappearing behind one and reappearing behind the other, they'll perceive a single object if they saw a continuous path of motion between the 2 occluders. But if they saw no motion between the 2 occluders, they'll infer that there's 2 objects that participated in this scene, consistent with the idea that infants track objects as moving continuously on spatiotemporally continuous paths through the layout. Now, the same abilities exist in some animals who, in the case of the object permanence and object continuity, to my knowledge, these abilities have not been shown in newborn human infants, but they have been shown in newborn animals of other species. And I want to talk about 2 labs that have been doing this over the years. The first to do it is the lab of Giorgio Valortigara, the University of Trento, working with newborn chicks and using the fact that chicks, first of all, can get up and walk around on their own, very much unlike newborn human infants, at birth, and they will tend to follow their mother as they move around, and that means they have to be able to identify her, and they learn to do that using visual information over the first 4 days or so. So with this method, their chicks spend their first 4 days imprinting to their mother, and then the object that serves as their mother in these studies will be an object like the objects that have been used in studies of infants, okay, human infants. So for example, a center occluded object, and then you can ask, they ask if the chick is familiarized, imprints to the center, the display with the center occluded object, what do they think mom looks like? Do they think she has a gap between the top and the bottom, or that she's connected? And the evidence is from the imprinting that they'll follow the connected object, not the object with the gap. Okay, so it's not a preference for the novel. It's going with the familiar imprinted object. So by similar logic, chicks have been shown after imprinting, to follow mom when she goes, if they've seen her hide behind an occluder, they will go and look for her behind that occluder. On the other hand, if after seeing her, sometimes go behind the occluder on the left and sometimes the occluder on the right, their vision is blocked. So they see that she's between the 2 occluders, but then when they can see again, she's nowhere to be seen. So they'll have no way of knowing whether she went to the left or to the right. Now, if those occluders are rotated backward, they will look for her in the place that leaves enough room for her to be there. In other words, representing that she's solid. So they're showing all the same abilities that the infants have shown, showing that they have the ability to represent at least one object out there as connected and solid and persisting. However, a number of people, most recently in my experience at AAAI, Jan LeCun, one of the pioneers of neural network modeling and a committed empiricist, pointed out that over those first 4 days when chicks are imprinting, they're getting a lot of visual information. In fact, he calculates that the amount of information you get in a few days of vision is vastly larger, orders of magnitude larger than all of the billions of words that have been fed to large language models that get so much press these days. So there's lots of information there. And consistent with the idea that this information is usable comes work that was published in Science about a month ago now, showing that if you train a neural network, a relatively simple neural network actually, but a convolutional neural network, if you train it on just a small amount of video data from a few days of a camera that's been mounted on the head of a baby, it can learn the names for a whole bunch of, and in addition to getting the video of the environment that the baby, that's visible to the baby, you also get the audio of the language that's audible for the baby. Pairing these two together, they find that the neural network will learn the meanings of some words from very small amounts of information. Now, there's a lot of caveats that I could make about this study. The network does not learn showing the same kinds of patterns that children do, but it raises a fair question, which is, do the chicks learn that mom is cohesive and continuously movable and solid over those first 4 days while they're imprinting to her? So an attempt to answer that question has recently been made by Justin Wood, who has conducted a series of experiments paralleling the Villor-Tagara experiments, but with one notable difference, which is instead of presenting chicks, newly hatched chicks, with real objects, he presents them with virtual objects on the computer screens that serve as the walls of the entire world that this chick is allowed to explore. The chick is born into a box, and there's 4 walls, and on it there are screens, and there's a single object that moves around these 4 walls. So in the first study that he did, the object, by the way, you're seeing 2 different views of it here. It's actually red, and it's being seen from a different view on the image above. This is the object to which the chick is going to imprint. It rotates, and it also translates continuously through space and within each of the 2 opposite walls of this box. What happens in this study is, I'm sorry, I must have missed a slide here. No, I lost. No, this is right, I'm sorry. So what happens in this study is that there's 2 places where mom can be, and Justin waits until the chick is far away from the side where he's going to present mom, and then the lights come up on that side, and mom is over there, and 2 screens come up to the left and right of her from the floor. And then one of 2 things happens. Either mom turns and moves behind one of the screens, or one of the screens moves forward and covers mom and then moves back to its original position, and mom can no longer be seen, implying that mom has moved with that screen and is now, and in both cases, therefore, mom should, on this trial, be behind the screen on the left. Across time, the chicks see mom moving behind the left screen or behind the right, sometimes on one of the 2 video panels, sometimes on the other opposite ones. Okay? Now, once mom is fully hidden, the whole scene freezes for 2 minutes, and the question is, where is the chick going to be? Okay? The reason that I should have said that because earlier today people were talking about probabilistic generative models and mental simulation, the reason for comparing the screen moving to the chick moving is that if the screen is moving, it requires something like a simulation process to track that mom has also moved behind that screen. At least it invites that kind of process. And so you might expect that situation, if the chick is doing the mental simulation, they will succeed, but they'll make more errors in that case than in the case where they can actually see where mom has moved. But anyway, to test the chick's ability to represent mom behind the correct screen, she's occluded. It takes about 6 seconds for her to be hidden, and then she remains hidden for 2 minutes. And they simply measure, through automatic tracking of the chick's position, where the chick is in the environment. And the question is, how much time does the chick spend near the screen that mom moved behind or that moved over her relative to the opposite screen? And here are the data. In blue, you see the effect for the case where it was mom who moved. In green, for the case where it was the screen that moved. And in both cases, there's a highly significant tendency for the chicks to remain on the side where they saw mom disappear. Although it declines over time, they don't retain faith in her permanence forever. It declines over time, but remains significant even all the way 2 seconds out, because there's many, many trials, thousands of trials here that they're analyzing over. So this is evidence both for object permanence and suggestively, at least, for mental simulation in these newborn animals. And it raises a further question. The question is, can chicks learn that mom actually moves discontinuously? So the method here is going to be very similar, but it's a training study with the same test measure, but with 2 different types of training. So in one type of training, the one that you see on the left followed by purple, what happens is that mom goes behind one of 2 screens, and as soon as she is hidden, either immediately after she disappears, or 5 seconds, 10 seconds, or 20 seconds later, the screen comes down, and in the natural world, there she is, behind the screen where she was hidden.
The unnatural world is exactly the same, except that when the screens come down, she's always behind the opposite screen. So if she was hidden on the left, she reappears on the right, and vice versa, violating continuity. Now, for 4 days, chicks get to see these events, getting thousands of trials, well, more than 1,000 trials of information that mom can teleport. She can go from one of these screens to the other without ever appearing between them. And the question is, what will they learn? Well, to get at what they learn, the test phase is the same as in the first experiment. After these 4 days of imprinting and training on the discontinuous motion, the screens come up, and instead of coming down immediately, they stay up for 2 minutes, and the question is, which of the two screens does the chick wait behind, okay? And the findings don't require two figures because they lie right on top of each other. The chicks wait behind the screen where mom disappeared. In other words, where in the unnatural world, they never saw her reappear. They never saw her reappear there, but that's where they expect her to be. So it looks like for chicks, object continuity is not only innate, it's also resistant to change, okay? They seem to be built to be representing the behavior of other animals as continuous over time, and presumably other objects as well. Okay, that was my first example of evidence that uses a combination of studies of humans with studies of other animals to get at the origins of knowledge in very young infants. Let me give you one more example, this time focused on the domain of number. Again, I'm going to start with newborn infants and with an experiment that was conducted some 15 years ago now by Véronique Izard in Paris. It involves a familiarization period where babies who are 1 to a couple of days old in the nursery are familiarized to sequences of sounds. In this experiment, they were syllables, always the same syllable, but it either was long and appeared 4 times, or it was short and appeared 12 times. Okay, and they heard a bunch of different syllables over time, separated by syllable sequences, separated by pauses, but always either four syllables to a sequence or 12 syllables to a sequence. And after 2 minutes of listening to this, the audio track continued, and they saw a succession of visual images, pictures presenting either 4 objects or 12 objects with no motion, just static pictures, and their looking time to those pictures was measured. And the assumption behind this research, which had been shown in a whole bunch of experiments on somewhat older infants, is it's the same phenomenon that you have if you're in a bar or a gym and there's a bunch of TV screens around, but only one of them has a soundtrack on. You'll tend to look at the event that corresponds to the sound that you're hearing. So the prediction was that they to see whether they would look at the display that presented the same number that they were hearing. I don't think I said this clearly. The infants were in 2 different groups. So half of them were familiarized with 4 sequences that always had 4 sounds in them, and the other with sequences that always had 12. And the prediction was that the 2 groups would show opposite looking preferences, each for the corresponding number. And that's what was obtained when they were presented with 4 versus 12, replicated with 6 versus 18, but a failure to show this effect with 4 versus 8, telling us a couple of things. One, that babies are sensitive to number, and its abstract number, over changes in modality, format, from a temporal sequence to a spatial array, and so forth. But nevertheless, it's an approximate system. And if you're a newborn, you can deal with a 3-to-1 numerical difference, but not a 2-to-1 numerical difference. Now, further studies have provided evidence for the same ability in older infants and children and adults in tasks preventing counting, and have found that these tasks activate the same brain region in infants and children and ordinary adults and mathematicians who are thinking about hard problems in their field. So strong evidence that this is developmentally invariant. But the evidence isn't fully satisfying. It seems like whenever you present babies with an array that we can describe in terms of the number of elements in that array, there are also other descriptions of it that are possible, the amount of stuff that's being taken up, or the complexity of the array, or something like that. So I want to tell you about one more very recent study that I had nothing to do with. It used a method, though, that was related to some of the studies going on with your group, George, today, so you can correct me if I get the method wrong. The study was conducted by Ghislaine Dahan-Lamberts and her colleagues in Paris. It used 3-month-old infants, so not newborns, but it otherwise was very similar to the Izard experiment, except it presented tones instead of syllables. But like the Izard experiment, it presented either sequences of 12 tones or sequences of 4 tones at any given moment in time. In this study, though, what happened is that the 3-month-old infants heard these tones while they were sleeping. At least when they were very, very drowsy, and for most of them while they were actually really sleeping. For about 4 hours, they were sleeping while their brain activity was being measured by high-density EEG, the same kind of 256 electrode system that was described earlier today. And in this case, the infants heard all of the sequences that are graphed up there. So they heard sequences where the individual tones were short and when they were long, when there were 4 of them, when there were 12 of them, and when the tone sequence was long versus relatively short, because the tones were tightly spaced together. And after each sequence that the infant heard, there was a pause. And that allowed them to train a set of decoders to detect, to look for brain signals that are specific to the 2 numbers that were used in this study, 4 versus 12. Okay, so they trained decoders by 3 different schemes. They used 3 schemes so that they could, across these schemes, strictly control the effects of sequence length and also individual tone length on the responses to number. And then they also trained these decoders to look separately at tiny, tiny time slices after the end of the last tone in each sequence, to see both, was there going to be a signal that's specific to number, and if so, when would it appear after the sequence? Because you don't know till the sequence ends how many tones you're going to be hearing in that sequence. When will that signal appear? And what they found is that for the first half a second or so after the end of each sequence, the decoders totally failed to decode for number. But then about 400 milliseconds in or a little more, they start picking up a signal for number, and it peaks at about 600 milliseconds after each of these sounds, okay? So they identified a brain signal that distinguished, correctly identified whether the infant had just heard, the sleeping infant had just heard 4 tones or 12 tones. But we could ask, was this number or was it rate or duration? And now they were able to do something equally cool, which was they trained other decoders to decode for a rate or to decode for duration. And they found that they could decode, these, by the way, are the same kinds of graphs that you saw in that first afternoon talk. They found that both rate and duration could be successfully decoded for, but if you compared the decoding to the decoding for number, you see that these are not overlapping in time. There are distinct, temporally distinct signals for duration and rate on the one hand and for number on the other, okay? So it looks like there's here a method for identifying and dissociating representations of time and number. Now, at this point, I was still a little bit unhappy with this study because I wondered, is this really number or is it something like onsets? I just keep getting all of these onsets, right? There's some temporal property. Okay, so it's not rate, it's not duration, but there's some temporal property here, some sensory property that's distinguishing these events. Well, to try to get at that, when either before a baby went to sleep, if they came into the lab wide awake, or after they woke up, if they came into the lab ready for a nap, The Dehaan-Lambert's team presented infants with visual displays like the ones that were presented in the Izzard study, the first behavioral study I told you about, of 4 versus 8 objects. And they took the decoder that had been trained, the decoders that had been trained on number, froze them so they're not going to get any further training, and just put them to work on decoding for number in the visual displays, these non-moving, non-temporal visual displays of 4 versus 12 dots. And what they found is that at those same durations at which they successfully decoded for number in the auditory sequences, that the decoding generalized to the visual arrays. So abstract number revealed not only by behavioral studies, but by studies of infant brains. Now, core knowledge of number, I'm presenting this for 2 reasons. One, it's one of the cases that's been investigated, I think, most systematically in infants. But the other reason is that it's also a case that's been investigated a lot in studies looking at older children and who are both dealing with number intuitively and starting to learn the language and symbols and operations of mathematics. And what this research reveals is that children's, first of all, their early number words map onto infants' number concepts. They tend to be approximate. Second, before kids actually start to be taught symbolic arithmetic, they're able to perform it if you allow them to perform with approximate accuracy. To do this, you have to present them with a problem, like you show an array of dots and you say, each of these is a cookie. This kid had this many cookies to start out with, and then they go into a box, and now he gets this many more, and they go into the same box, and you ask the kid about how many cookies are in that box. Is it more or less than this other contrasting amount that the child gets to see? And the first thing a child will say in this situation is, I haven't learned to add yet, I don't know the answer to that question. Whereupon you say, guess, okay? And the kids' guesses are about as accurate as the judgments of infants are in comparable experiments dealing with combinations of approximate number. So that's another piece of evidence. Another piece of evidence is that approximate number abilities are predictive of symbolic numerical abilities as children start to learn number words and symbols and arithmetic operations. What's more, there's some evidence that tasks that exercise intuitive approximate numerical abilities enhance children's school performance. And this is one of 4 systems that seem to contribute to children's, for which there's evidence that they contribute to children's learning of mathematics. 2 systems of number, one exact but limited to very small numbers, and the other approximate and not so limited, and 2 systems for capturing geometry, one that applies to the geometry of the navigable layout and one that applies to the shapes of objects. But core knowledge is limited. For one thing, it can't account for things like cultural innovation or cultural learning, at least not all by itself. It's shared by animals, but no other animal acquires human culture or goes to school or learns any of the symbolic systems that children can learn, often quite readily. Furthermore, most explicit concepts that we come to have combine information across different core domains. But core domains, when studied in animals or infants, or for that matter in adults who are using them without awareness, these systems are not readily combined. For example, if you show a baby or an adult an array of 3 objects, they have 2 different core systems that can deal with this. One is a system that represents this as a thing and another thing and a third thing, a system that's highly useful for naive physical reasoning, which we also heard about earlier today, and the other as a set that's different from other sets as long as they're different by a 3-to-1 ratio, right? So 3 of these things would be seen as big, a set larger than 1 and a set smaller than 9. But what neither infants nor adults in the experiments where you're catching them unawares, so this processing is all going on unconsciously and automatically, you see the alternating signatures of representations of small numbers of objects on the one hand and representations of approximate numerical magnitudes on the other, but you don't see those signatures simultaneously. Which raises the question, what more is needed to form representations like exactly 3 objects? And this is what brings me to language learning in infancy. Now, I started with Roger Brown because as an undergraduate at Harvard, I learned that language learning begins when you're about 15 months old and you start to talk. Later, Jacques Mehler showed that that's totally wrong. Language learning begins before birth, and it makes huge strides over the course of the first year. This finding comes from his work and the work of many people who were his colleagues or students or friends, or all 3. Now, some of the methods that are used to study language learning in infancy in the first year of life are very similar to the methods that were used for looking at infants' representation, the behavioral methods used for looking at infants' representations of objects and number, including both the behavioral measures and also EEG has been used a lot for language. And here are some of the highlights findings of this field. By the way, I should have said, let me go back a slide. All those people there, you don't see my face on there for a reason. I do not study language learning. I am an admiring consumer of this field, okay? But it is not my field. 100% of the credit for everything I'm about to say now goes to those people there, not me. Anyway, here are some of the things that their work has shown us. 1, that language learning begins in the womb at birth. A baby will show a preference, manifest through selectively acting to produce speech that has the prosody of their native language. At birth, babies distinguish content words like nouns and verbs and adjectives that refer to things in the world from function words like articles and pronouns that play grammatical roles in a sentence but don't refer to external things, using a bunch of prosodic cues and other cues like word frequency and stress. Now, by 4 months, babies are sensitive to function word dependencies, the beginnings of syntax. So at this age, a German-hearing infant listening to sentences in Italian, if they get to hear sentences with the Italian version in English, the sentences would be things like, the sister is dancing, the brother is singing, the child has danced, okay? And then, after 20 minutes or so of hearing that, they hear an ungrammatical combination of the same familiar function words, the little affix on the verb and the auxiliary verb. So they hear something like, the sister has dancing, okay? That's ungrammatical. The babies detect that grammatical violation. The German-hearing babies detect the grammatical violation in Italian. Their German-speaking parents do not. Okay, so function words are some of the hardest things for us to learn as adult language learners. The babies are picking them up at 4 months of age. Now, by 6 months, they're starting to learn content word meanings, and by about 7 months, they're learning another basic syntactic property of their language. The linguists talk about it as whether the language is left branching or right branching, but think of it as, does the subject come before the predicate or does the subject come after? Do you say the tree, like in English, or tree the, like in Japanese, okay? By 6 or 7 months, kids are picking up on that basic distinction for their language. And if they're multilingual and learning languages with 2 different head complement orderings, they're picking up on both of them. So in summary, before kids begin speaking, they seem to have deciphered all the fundamental aspects of their native language, from phonology to syntax to semantics. Now, they work on these different aspects in parallel over the course of the first year. It's not like they start with sounds and then only later work up to grammar and meaning. They're working on all of it at once. The first things they master seem to be the aspects of language that are hardest for us to master as adults. And sensitivity to these properties emerges before the children have developed confident knowledge of any of the words in their native language. This raises the question, How do they learn language? Does language learning relate to core knowledge? And an interesting fact is that it seems as if all over the world, children learn language from the people who are in their social world, not from the radio, not from an overheard conversation in a foreign language by someone you don't know, but through engaging with the people in their social world. So that raises the question, what do babies know about people? How much time do I have, George? Oh, good. Okay, then I think I can do this. All right, great. Great. Okay, so what do babies know about people? Well, well, as I showed you, there's two core systems for dealing with people. Let me start with the one, what babies know about people as agents who cause their own motion and cause changes in the world. First of all, they know that people tend to minimize the cost of their actions. So classic experiments conducted first in Hungary but now replicated all over the world, this is one from our lab, show that if you show a baby a person who has reached over a barrier to get to an object on the far side of the barrier, then they see that repeatedly, then if you take the barrier away, they don't expect the person to repeat the same action they'd performed before. Instead, they expect them to take a direct path to that object, the more efficient way to get there. Babies also know that people take higher cost actions for higher valued goals. So if they see an animated character with eyes and self-generated motion, triggering a representation of the character as an agent, if they see it climb a high hill to get to one goal object, but only a lower hill to get to the other goal object, then they infer that if, at test, the two bottom images, that same agent is flanked by the two objects on a level playing field, they will go toward the object for which they took the higher cost action. Now, in order to pursue goals, you have to be able to detect objects at a distance. And further studies on young infants show that as young as about 3 months of age, babies expect people who act on objects to act on the objects that are visible to them. So if a person is flanked by two objects, both of which are at least partly visible, then they expect that if they choose to act on one, they have a preference for that one. But if one of the two objects is fully hidden behind something else and they act on the other object, they infer no preference between the two, given that there wasn't a choice to be made since the person could only detect one of the two objects. Finally, babies infer that people cause changes in objects only on contact. So if they see an event that violates this, which can be created by taking a movie of a person who's acting on an object on contact and splicing it and freezing it so it looks like their action stops short of the object, there's a pause and then it lights up on their own, then they no longer infer that the person will act efficiently if you take that barrier away. So that says that, now note that all of these properties are abstract and they're interconnected. So contact is connecting to efficiency, choices are connected to perceptibility, and cost is connected to value, okay? They're abstract interconnected concepts. So what is this core knowledge of agents doing? How is it functioning in infants? I think the evidence suggests that it's supporting infants' learning about the specific actions that agents are likely to engage in, and the specific goals of those actions. And I'm going to give you just one example of this. This is from a study of a series of studies by Brandon Wu and Shari Liu, who were in my lab at the time. Brandon's now moving to the University of California at Santa Barbara, and Shari's at Johns Hopkins University. And they did this study together on 3-month-old infants, presenting them with events in which a person was facing two distinct objects, consistently reached for one of them, and when she touched it, the objects changed their state. Therefore showing that it's a causal action. And after she did that repeatedly, the positions of the two objects switched, and the question was, what do the babies expect the person to reach for? Do they expect her to reach to the same object or to the same location in space?
And the finding at 3 months of age was that they were completely neutral between these two expectations. They found the events where she did each of these things alternately on alternating trials to be equally interesting, okay? Now, this study had been conducted previously by other labs, and they had concluded from it that infants have no notion that actions are goal-directed. They simply think that these are aimless movements through space. But Shari and Brandon had a different idea. The idea was that infants represented these actions as goal-directed, but were open-minded as to what the specific goal of an acts of reaching are likely to be. So for us as adults, we will most often assume if somebody is reaching for something, that there's an object that they're reaching for. We'll also most often assume that if someone's walking somewhere, there's a place they want to get to. But maybe babies see walking or reaching as goal-directed actions without yet having the more specific knowledge that the goal is likely to be an object if it's a reach, and it's likely to be a place if it's locomotion, okay? So with that idea in mind, they ran 2 more experiments. Now, these were run on Zoom during the pandemic, but the logic was the same as the one run in the lab that I just told you about. They see a person who has an object goal and manifests it by reaching for the same object in 2 different locations on alternating familiarization trials. And then at tests, the object appears in a 3rd location, and the question is, where will the baby expect him to reach? And they expect him to reach to the 3rd new location, having seen that he varied his action as a function of where that particular object was. It was clear he didn't want to go to a particular place, he wanted a particular thing. Symmetrically, they did an experiment where the person exhibited a place goal. He reached always to the same location, sometimes encountering one object there and sometimes encountering a second object there. So they were then, when they were then tested where a 3rd object appeared there, they expected him to reach for that 3rd object. Providing evidence that at 3 months, infants can learn that reaches are aimed to objects or places. And then further studies that they did showed that they only learn this when they're presented with controlled motions, not like accidental falling of a hand on an object, right? It's only when they see guided motion toward a goal that triggers this system. Providing evidence that before infants learn about the typical goals of different kinds of actions, they view other people's actions as costly and causal and goal-directed. This is another case like the language case where abstract properties seem to be coming in, and the object case seem to be coming in first. What about core knowledge of people as social beings? Well, there's been lots of hints in the evidence that there's a core knowledge system for viewing people not as agents who cause changes in the world, but as social beings who experience the world and share their experiences with other social beings. For one thing, infants are highly attentive to faces that appear to be looking at them. When they see a person's face looking at them up close, and then the person does something, particularly, by the way, if it's oral movements, you can ask me about that later if you want, what's special about them. They tend to imitate their expressions as best they can. And they also tend to share other people's states of attention. So if they see a face that's looking straight at them, but then the eyes shift to the side, they will engage in a spontaneous movement of attention to that side of space, which can be tracked not because they're directly moving their eyes, but because if an object now appears in the direction that they've moved their attention to, they'll look at it faster than if it's moved, the object appears on the opposite side. Now, none of these abilities are unique to humans. They've all been found in other animals. The abilities are also highly limited. They capture these kind of abstract aspects of how people behave. But human infants are totally equally willing to accept as a social partner, at least as newborns, a human face, a monkey face, a sheep face. Baby sheep are equally happy to accept human faces, right? So no specific knowledge about what my potential social partners are going to look like, but specific knowledge about what they're apt to experience and what they're apt to do and what I'm apt to want to do with them. So what might these behaviors mean? Here's my best guess, that infants are viewing people under these conditions as social beings who experience the world and who
share their experiences with other social beings, including the infant, in states of engagement. So I think when they see a face looking at them, what they're representing is this person's engaging with me and experiencing me. When they respond themselves by reproducing a gesture that another person has made, I think they're signaling, copy that, I'm engaging with you, I'm tracking your behavior, and I'm motivated to act, to share your actions. And finally, when they follow with their attention the gaze of someone that has moved from looking straight at them to looking out to the side, I think what's underlying that is a sense that there's something out there, an experience out there that we can share. Now, consistent with this guess, there's evidence that from Lindsay Powell at University of California, San Diego now, that by 4 months, infants who are shown in experiments social characters who imitate one another, expect them to affiliate with each other. That's consistent with this view. I am about to run out of battery power. Let's not let this end my talk. Is there an outlet here? Thanks. Yes, great. Okay, so I've said that core knowledge supports learning. In this case, I just want to give one example of that. Core social knowledge supports infants learning about their own social network. This is experiments done by Ashley Thomas, working with Rebecca Sachs and me at the time. She's now on the faculty at Harvard. And this was also done during the pandemic and capitalized on the fact that parents were at home but willing to be in studies. And this was one that demanded quite a bit of them. The first thing parents had to do was make a movie of themselves at home to Ashley's direction on their webcam and send it to Ashley. And in that movie, they look forward, they look down to the left, they look forward, they look down to the right, and they say different things while they're looking in these different directions. Then Ashley did her magic and added puppets to the movie and created a set of events in which it looks like the two puppets are turning to look at this baby's mom. Each of them is saying something different, and the mom is responding to one of them by saying yet a third thing, and to the other one by imitating what the puppet had said. Okay, so they see mom imitating one of these puppets and not the other. Now, after seeing that, they see videos in which mom has gone away, but the two puppets are there on the screen. They're facing forward and they're calling to the baby by name. So, hi, George, how are you doing? Okay, you know, the two puppets there. And the question is, where will the baby look? Okay, now, you might think the baby would look at whichever puppet. Maybe they think that the one that mom was imitating is just a more interesting puppet in general, and they would look at that puppet whether the puppet was calling their name or not. So there was a control trial added into this experiment where the two puppets, instead of looking straight at, or actually in a different condition, instead of seeing two puppets that were looking at the baby and calling the baby's name, they saw two puppets who were looking away and calling the name of another baby in the study, okay? And so the question was, what would happen in that case? I guess before I give you the results, let me tell you the one other control that was run. We wanted to see if it turned out that babies would learn that one of these puppets was more likely to know them because they'd interacted with their mom. Was the fact that it was their mom doing any of the work here, or was it just they interacted with a person, and so they're more sociable, so I'll think they'll be sociable with me too. So the final control in this series of studies was babies were tested on different days, not only with videos involving their own mom, but with videos involving the mom of another kid in the study and a different set of puppets, okay? With all of those controls, here are the main results. which is in orange you see the looking to the puppet who knew their name versus said the other name when it was their mom who had, had interacted with the puppets. In green, you see that the effect from that first condition goes away when it's another baby's mom who interacted. So what's going on here? The babies are seeing that their mom is engaging socially with one of two puppets, and they're inferring from that this puppet is a potential social partner for me, okay? They're not doing that in any of the other cases where it's not their mom, where the puppet's not, or where the puppet's not engaging with them. So it looks like infants are representing social characters as individuals with relations to one another. They're inferring in this situation that there's a social network that's connecting their mom, one of these two puppets, and them. This is in contrast to a very popular idea, which is that maybe the first thing babies know is that people have certain social attributes, like somebody's friendly, right? The purpose of all these controls was exactly to test for those possibilities, and we find no evidence that babies are characterizing one of these puppets as just friendly in general, irrespective of who they see that puppet interacting with. Rather, it looks like this core social system is supporting learning about who is in my social network and how do these different people relate to one another. So in summary, looks like there's two distinct core knowledge systems that apply to people. A system for representing people as agents who act and as social beings who engage, and each is supporting learning. Now, each also supports infants' language learning. As agents, people act efficiently. They'll take the shortest path they can to get to their goal, and they act relevantly to the current situation. If there's an obstacle between them and the goal, they will go around it, okay? Now, if you apply that to language, it suggests that infants will expect people's speech acts, like their other acts, to be efficient and relevant. As social beings, infants, I think, expect other adults to share experiences with them. Now, in a language context, sharing experiences is what you do when you share with someone else your perspective on the current situation under discussion, okay? So I think that core knowledge from these two core systems, both applied to people, could predispose infants to expect that the language that people use people will behave in accord with Gracian norms of communication when they talk to them. That they'll speak informatively and relevantly and economically. If that's true, then infants are in a position to learn things about the world from the things that people say to them. Here's an example. A study that was done in Sandy Waxman's lab with 4-month-old infants. She presented them with a series of dinosaurs, choosing dinosaurs that looked very different from one another. And she tested infants in 2 different conditions. In one condition, they heard a melody accompanying every one of these dinosaurs. In the other condition, they heard a voice say, "Look at the toma," okay? Then, after seeing those, they got a silent test, no melody, no speech, involving yet another dinosaur or a fish, okay? Now, when they heard the melody, they looked equally at the 2 objects in this test. But when they heard the word, they looked longer at the fish, okay? Categorizing the new dinosaur as a member, viewing the dinosaurs as members of a single set, okay? So Waxman argued, and I think she's right, that what's happening in this situation is children are taking the person's speech to be relevant to this situation, they're talking about dinosaurs, and to be informative. By using the same word, they're informing the infant, in effect, that this word applies to all of these objects. They go together in some way, okay? So that's one example. But this study kind of puzzled me because the shape representation task looked really difficult. And it got me thinking about how babies might represent shape in general. Now, the babies that we test were all born after the Industrial Revolution, so the prototypical objects that they encounter are factory-made artifacts, and they tend to be composed from geometrically simple parts, like the flat surface of a table versus the symmetrical table legs that support it, and, or a cup and a handle, and so forth. However, our ancient systems for representing objects predate the Industrial Revolution, and very likely the objects that were most important for our ancestors to represent certainly were not factory-made artifacts. They likely were living kinds, things that grow, like plants and animals. Now, living kinds tend to grow by, they have a primary vertical axis and they grow by branching, okay? Now, that kind of representation could serve to unify all of the dinosaurs in the Waxman studies, since they all had feet, whereas the fish only had a tail that had a different underlying branching structure. We now know, moreover, that infants are sensitive to the branching structures of objects, and they even impose medial axis, branching medial axes on objects that don't lend themselves to them, like a rectangle. But if infants start out sensitive to the shapes that characterize natural living objects, then children are going to face a problem, given that the ones that we're testing, at least, were born after the Industrial Revolution and mostly have to deal with factory-made artifacts. So how do they learn to deal with them? Well, I think some research conducted 20 years ago, long enough ago to be out of date as far as the camera here goes, but conducted with children about 20 years ago, suggests an answer to this question. She looked at children's abilities to recognize objects by what she called their simple geometric caricatures. So the caricature of the camera, just a rectangular solid with a cylindrical solid in front of it. Similarly for the ice cream cone and the pepperoni pizza. And she presented these to children after getting measures from their parents of the number of nouns in their vocabulary, nouns that could potentially be object names. And she did 2 tests of object recognition. A verbal test, where she gives them the name of the kind of object she's looking for. She presents them with 3 objects and asks, which is the camera, okay? And a more difficult task, where she just presents them with the 3 objects and asks, what can you do with them? All right. Now, the second test was more difficult, but the pattern is the same in both of them. The children who knew more than 100 object names performed as well with the caricatures as they did with the realistic objects, which everybody was also given. But the children who had fewer object names than that performed much better with they're the ones who were presented on the left of each of these figures, performed much better with the realistic objects and quite poorly with the caricatures. So it looks like kids who know more object names are better able to represent objects as compositions of 3D shapes. And this is my second example of a case where language learning may be adapting children's shape-based object recognition to the local environment. But I want to end by talking about, I think, a much more important effect of language on children's cognitive development. Language is a supremely good system, maybe the only really good system we have, initially at least, for conveying other people's perspectives on the world. And to introduce this, I want to take you through a series of experiments on 15-month-old toddlers that the toddlers roundly failed. So these were also conducted during the pandemic by Brandon Wu in his home. He had a friend sitting on the floor facing 2 photographs. One of them was presented right side up for the friend. This is the one on the left. Right side up for the friend and upside down from the perspective of the baby, the toddler. The other, it's the reverse, upside down for the friend and right side up for the toddler. And he consistently reached either to pictures that were upside down, which is, I think, what you're seeing here, upside down for him, or to pictures that were right side up for him. That was counterbalanced across babies, whether it was the upright or the upside down that this person would reach for. But after he did that for a while, during a period of familiarization, he then got up and walked around to the other side of the room. So now his perspective is the same as the baby's. And the question is, where will the babies expect him to reach?
Will they expect him to reach to the picture that's the same from his perspective or from their own perspective? And the babies failed this task. They expected him to reach for the picture that was the same from their own perspective, and looked longer when he reached to the picture that for him was the same as what that had the property that he was consistently reaching for previously. Okay, so we found this in this first experiment. It's a significant effect in the wrong direction, and replicated it in 6 other experiments. I just want to give you quickly 2 of them. First, we kept replicating it because we couldn't quite believe that they were as egocentric as they were. I've spent my life resisting Piagetian psychology, and here's babies being spectacularly egocentric. My first thought was, well, maybe they just over-zoom. They're looking at a computer screen, and they can't really track the position of the actor really well. So we changed the task. And in this task, the question is not, what is the actor experiencing when he looks at each of these objects? The question is just, which of these 2 objects can he see and which one can't he see? But otherwise, the task is logically the same as the one I just showed you. So the one he can see is hidden to the baby, hidden to the toddler, and the one the toddler can see is hidden to the actor. Okay? So he starts out on the back, he comes around to the other side, and now the toddlers succeed. Okay, so they're able to take account of what another person can and cannot see when that other person's vantage point differs from their own. But they aren't taking account of how they're experiencing what they see. Are they experiencing an upright face or an upside down face or what? So that was one of the things I worried about. The other one was maybe presenting faces, all they care about is that they're faces. They don't care about what orientation they're in. So we went to something where orientation matters more, the well-known rabbit-duck illusion, where as you rotate this figure from one orientation to the other, it changes from one animal to the other. The first thing we did was show kids the rotation so they could see how it starts out looking like a duck and ends up looking like a rabbit. Then we ran the experiment following the same logic as in the faces studies, but since it's only a 90-degree rotation, that means that the actor is starting out 90 degrees rotated relative to the baby and ending up with the orientation aligned with the babies. And once again, the babies fail in this situation. And by failing, I mean they systematically attribute their own perspective to the actor. They expect the actor, when he comes to his new position, to reach for the object that looks the same to them, to the babies, as the object he was reaching for before. Now, having gotten all of these failures, we wondered, would language do anything to help kids understand? If the person starts to talk, well, they get the idea, this person's trying to be informative. He's trying to share experiences with me. He's trying to tell me about his experience. So to see that, and the idea for this is that language is actually the supreme tool that we have for conveying our perspectives on things. Most of the things that we traffic in, we're able to view from multiple different perspectives, and we use language to distinguish between them. So the question was, would children do this? And I have just one experiment to share with you. Please don't take it to the bank. It needs to be replicated and extended, but I'm sharing it anyway. So in this study, we've got an actor, and he starts out with his perspective aligned with that of the baby and says, I see a duck, I see a bunny, and then he says he wants one of them. I want the duck, or I want the bunny. But when he actually, that's one condition. In the other condition, we wanted to distinguish informative language from just, attention-getting speech. So in the other condition, we took out all the content words and used only function words, which are uninformative about a person's particular perspective on an object. So I see one here, I see something, I want something now, or I want one now. Then the person turns to the side and reaches for the object that he says he wanted from his perspective versus from he reaches in alternation to each of the 2 objects, and the question is, which one does the infant think is the one that he considered to be the duck or the bunny, whichever one he said he wanted. And now what we get is that in the case using only function words, we replicate the failure from the previous experiments. but in the case using content words, the effects reverse and the kids get it right. So it looks like language is supporting children's use of other people's perspectives. So let me finally, with this, get to education, and then I'm done. I submit that formal schooling, the purpose of formal schooling, more than anything else, is to impart for children new ways of viewing the world, new perspectives on the world. You can look out the window of the classroom and see a surface that you can walk on that looks flat. But you can learn from the teacher that actually this is a small piece of a globe, that we are standing on an enormous globe, all right? Or you can look up in the sky and see a point of light and learn that although that looks like this tiny little twinkle in the sky, it's a huge sun, as big as our sun, just much further away. I think most of what children learn in school involves using language to convey new perspectives on familiar phenomena. And one of the domains in which we see this, clearly, I think we see this in all domains, but one of them is mathematics, where you can come to see simple things that you were able to pick out before you got to school, like a set of 7 things. You can now see how that can be represented as the union of 2 smaller sets, or as a portion of a larger set. And eventually, obviously, as your mathematical education progresses, you'll get more and more different perspectives on objects. Now, crucially, none of these perspectives can be learned by pure perception. It's not an accident that all those other animals that don't have language also don't have schools, right? We use language to distinguish these different perspectives on the world. And so the question is then, how do children learn them? And I want to end by telling you about 3 experiments that I've been involved in India, conducted in collaboration with some economists and educators, and 2 wonderful students at the time, now faculty, Molly Dillon, psychology student, and Josh Dean, who was an economics student at the time. And great organizations, the Jameel Poverty Action Lab and Pratham, which is the largest NGO in India. And let me start by telling you how I got into this work. Back in May of 2012, I met Esther Duflo. Now, at the time, Esther Duflo was a professor of economics at MIT. She was the co-founder of the Jameel Poverty Action Lab and the co-author of a wonderful book that I recommend to all of you called Poor Economics. Now she's a whole bunch of other fancy things. But at the time, that May, she was giving the Tanner Lectures on Human Values at Harvard. And she gave a lecture in which she essentially argued that poor people are just like us, with one exception: they are living in different circumstances. But if we lived in the circumstances that they are living in, we would make the choices that they're making, and we would engage in the actions that they're engaging in. That there is one underlying psychology for all people, and it plays out differently in different situations, depending on the constraints of those situations. So I am hearing this, thinking about babies and universal core knowledge and how it underlies everything, and I can't wait to go talk to this woman. But before I get a chance to talk to her, she comes up to me. I had been profiled in a newspaper that day, and there was a photograph of me on the front page of the paper. She recognized me. She comes up, and it was about work on mathematics. She comes up to me and says, "Do you have any interest in research that might be useful for a change?" Okay? So I thought about this for a minute and thought, I don't know if I am. But then we had lunch together, and she presented me with a gorgeous challenge. So I'm presenting it to you. The challenge was this. There's, as I said, this wonderful organization, Pratham, an education NGO in India, that every couple of years does a census of children's learning of reading and math in school. And these are the data for math. I'm giving the most recent one here. It came out at the end of last year based on data from about 750,000 kids collected at the end of 2022. And the way the study works is you have a card, you go out into the field, and you find kids who are in school, you find out what grade they're in and how regularly they attend. That's where this information about how 95% of kids are in school and so forth comes from. And then depending on what grade they say, you start them on a different place in these cards. So for example, let me do this with a pointer. For example, if they're in 3rd grade, then you start by inviting them to choose 2 of these problems that were part of the 2nd grade curriculum and solve them. Now, if a child solves them correctly, then they go on to the division problems, which are presented in 4th grade. If they fail to solve the problems correctly, they go back to problems that they should have been able to solve in 1st grade. And in this way, they get categorized as being at one or another level of learning of mathematics with regard to the Indian curriculum. So what does this study show? Well, across those 700,000 plus people, what it shows is that in 5th grade, after having completed 4th grade mathematics where division was taught, only 1 kid in 4 is able to do the division problems, okay? And in 3rd grade, only 1 kid in 4 is able to do the subtraction problems. You get that by adding those 2 numbers together that were taught in 2nd grade. So 3/4 of the kids are failing to learn the curriculum. So Esther's challenge to me, you think babies are so smart, you think children are such great learners, why aren't these kids learning math in school? So, and what can we do about it? So that challenged us to take the findings from studies of infants, translate them into games that we hoped might be fun for children to play, try those games out on kids in Massachusetts, and then send them to our collaborators in India who took the same games and tried them out there. And the first surprise was, I thought, it would take a lot of work to introduce Indian kids to these games because we were told they have no such games in their homes. But kids actually took to them right away. The videos that were shared, it was really hard to tell looking at them who was a Cambridge kid, a Boston kid, and who was a kid in Delhi. And with these games, we've now conducted 3 different field experiments. So in the first field experiment, we used only intuitive games, 2 games exercising numerical concepts and 2 exercising geometric concepts, all based on research on core knowledge of number and geometry. And as I said, the kids played the games very readily. And we evaluated the games by randomizing children in 210 classrooms to 3 different conditions of 70 classrooms each, a total of about 1,500 kids, to either get the 4 math games or to get 4 games that had similar rules and materials, but in a different domain. We chose mental state reasoning, so instead of number and geometry, it's perceptions and desires or emotions. Then that was the active control condition. And then the 3rd condition was no treatment, just the regular preschools that they were attending. And the study focused on kids whose preschool teachers predicted they were going on to 1st grade the next year, okay? So for the last 3 months of preschool, they were playing these games, and they were evaluated both on their intuitive skills and on their symbolic skills, like knowledge of numerals or names of shapes and things like that, in the domain that if these games stimulated conversation, they would be exposed to. And they were tested before the intervention to get a baseline, and then at 3 time points after the intervention, first in the first 3 months after the preschool ended, which was their summer break, then in the middle of the 1st grade year, and then finally at the end of the 1st grade year for the 3 months after the end of the 1st grade year. And what we found was that, this is published, so I won't show you the data, but what we found was that the intuitive social play of the games with a group leader, with within the preschool classroom had enduring effects on children's intuitive math concepts. A full year later, after the end of first grade, the kids who, even though they had no access to the games for the previous year, they were still better at numerical and geometrical intuitions than were the kids who hadn't played the games. But when we instead ask about their learning of symbolic math in school, we found there was no effect of the games whatsoever. Okay, they did not improve the kids' learning in school. So take one led us to take two. In take two, we decided to combine the intuitive materials with the language and symbols of mathematics. And to do that, we created 4 different conditions for this experiment. In the first condition, kids played with intuitive materials alone, like the ones on the left there. In the second condition, they played with symbolic materials alone. So instead of having pictures of 2 triangles, you have the numeral 2 and so forth. And in a third condition, they got half of the intuitive materials and half of the symbolic materials and played them on alternating days. We genuinely did not know whether that condition would be the best or the worst. You could make a case either way, right? They're getting twice as much demands on them with half the amount of material. Maybe they'll fall apart in that condition. But in any case, we had those 3 treatment conditions and then no treatment control. And here are the findings. And to me, they were really surprising. You see in green the performance of the kids in the mixed condition. And if you look at the top line, the green line is level with the blue line, which is the intuitive abilities of the kids who were playing with 100% intuitive games versus half intuitive, half symbolic. And it shows that the symbolic and the intuitive games were synergizing in that mixed condition. They were doing every bit as well as the kids who were getting twice as much of the intuitive material, both at that first end line and at the end a year later after the end of first grade. Similarly, for the symbolic skills, now compare the green bars to the orange bars, and you see that getting half the symbols is as good, but also intuitive material is as good as getting all of the symbols, both in the first end line and at the end. So it looks like these games synergized with each other. And with that, the Delhi government invited us to bring the games into the schools for a scale-up pilot to see whether they could be integrated with the school, the citywide school math curriculum. So their invitation specified that we bring them both to kindergarteners, who you can see here playing on the floor, and first graders, who you see playing at desks. So we had games at 2 levels of difficulty for those 2 conditions. Now, playing the games required a real reorganization of the classrooms, because the way classrooms work in Delhi is each child, and actually I'm told this is true in most of India, each child sits by themselves at a desk that's spatially separated from everyone else, and they sit and they listen to a single child who's called on to go to the front of the room and recite some arithmetic facts or something like that. We wanted kids to be active, we wanted them to be playing, we wanted them to be talking about number and geometry. So we had the teachers rearrange the classroom so that during game playing time, which was for 3 hours, 3 separate 1-hour sessions each week during time devoted to math instruction, their desks were pushed together. And the play was cooperative within each group of 4 kids and competitive across the groups, okay? So the kids are working together to get the best score in the best amount of time to beat all the other groups in the classroom at each of the 4 different math games. And then to evaluate the effects of this intervention, the classes were randomized to just 2 conditions now. Either they got these games or they got the standard curriculum for that much more time, okay, for an extra 3 hours every week. And then they were tested before and after. For the economists, the rationale for this study is it's a scale-up experiment. The games are administered by the regular teachers. We were completely hands-off. This was out of our hands from beginning to end, okay? But the rationale for me was
we're having kids play in a way that's going to be linking school math to their intuitions, and it's going to be occurring in a social context where they benefit by helping each other to play better, in the competition with the other groups within the classroom. So this is the only study I've been involved in with them so far, where I would wake up in the middle of the night discovering I had just had a terrible nightmare, okay? This was actually terrifying. We were intervening on kids learning in school. Now, we know that only about a quarter of them are likely to learn the curriculum. But I realized that in this particular study, we had a chance of making that number end up worse, right? We were depriving them of some of this curriculum to be doing these other activities that they were not going to be assessed on. So basically, I was terrified that we were going to have negative effects. I was also terrified that we were going to have negative effects on the classroom. These kids were used to sitting quietly and listening to the teacher. We were having them come together and play raucously. Was this going to totally undermine the classroom discipline? It seemed like it possibly would. I'm almost done, I really am. We also wondered, would the teachers accept the games, right? And yes, I already said I was terrified about the curriculum. Here's what we found, fortunately. We found that for the kindergartners, we actually didn't see a benefit for their intuitions, and I now think that's because we took away some of the intuitive value of presenting arrays of dots by grouping them by sets of 10. I wouldn't do that with kindergartners again. But on the really important measures, their learning of symbolic math and their composite score, we see benefits in the kindergartners. And for the first graders, we see benefits across the board on all of the measures. So how do children learn math in school? I want to end with 3 suggestions. First, I think children may learn math best when school curricula build on their intuitions, pairing materials that exercise those intuitions with the language and symbols of mathematics. I also think that they may learn best when their attempts to learn individually are paired with attempts to learn in groups that allow them to communicate with each other, to articulate what they know and don't know, and to learn from one another. I think that's both motivating and probably cognitively helpful. And finally, based on reports by teachers, I think teachers may teach best when they're aware of children's mathematical intuitions, aware of what the children already know and have available to build on. Teacher after teacher said to us, I was super pessimistic. I thought this study would never work. The children were going to be bewildered by it. And they were surprised to see that actually the children were able to make sense of all of these materials. So I want to end, I think this is my last slide, that I'm presenting this field research to you not only because we're in a building in a department of psychology and education, but because I think that there's real potential synergies between field research in education on the one hand and basic research in cognitive science. So field research lets us study how children learn in the noisy, multifaceted environments in which their actual learning is taking place. I've spent my life studying children's learning in labs, but guess what? Children don't do very much learning in labs. They do learning in their homes, in their neighborhoods, in their schools. Field research lets you get at that. Field research also gets at causation when you use randomized designs. And it allows you to tap changes in children's knowledge over long time spans, more than a year for some of our studies. If it hadn't been for the pandemic, that last study I told you about, we had planned further end lines, but India's school closed for 2 years, so we couldn't do them. Now, I also think that basic research in cognitive science can return the favor to field research in education, because there is one drawback to randomized field experiments. It's that they can tell us if a given intervention has had a causal impact, but they can't tell us why it had the impact that it had. Because in order for an educational intervention to be successful, it's got to be multifaceted. And at the end of the day, you don't know which facets of that intervention were actually cognitively useful for kids and which ones weren't. This is, I think, where labs can come in and complement the information we get from the field to get a deeper understanding of children's learning. So thanks.
Thank you very much, Liz. I'm sure there's many questions, and although it's late, the floor is open for questions, and those of you that have questions, you should ask Liz, or eventually we can also ask her during dinner, but if you have questions, you can do it now.
Let me just say, we started late too, and I ran on late. I'm very grateful to those of you who are still here. It's an honor to be here, and I'm glad you're still here.
Any questions?
A very nice talk, thank you.
Thank you.
Although I'm not a nativist, I am always surprised by how much of the first part of your talk, not the application to education and your involvement with the Indian curriculum. The first part, you reviewed a large number of studies where for each one of them, we can have a sort of low-level interpretation based, for example, on associative learning mechanisms, where the mother talks to, or the voice of the mother, or a high-level sort of account that you seem to favor. But what I'm always surprised is to see how much you have to talk to convince about the results, how much of the inference is your own, not the baby's. So I'd like to invite you to because, for example, Povinelli has done the same thing with chimps. And at the end, he always concluded that the low-level account was better, and to his surprise. So when I look at some of the data, like Tom Bauer, for example, on cross-modal matching, a sort of a-modal language that makes... if Piaget devalued the abilities of infants, aren't you making the opposite sin of making these children amazing learners, but I don't know exactly what they learn? I mean, what are the principles of learning that you put forward here? What is it that they learn? So,
well, the experiments that I talked about on infants first are not learning experiments. They're probing the things that infants don't have to learn because they already, those abilities are innate. And the evidence that they're innate does not come from the studies of human infants. It comes from the studies of animal models. So I don't see how you can make an associative account for the findings of the controlled reared chicks who are presented with nothing but thousands of trials where mom is teleporting and don't learn that mom teleports, but presented with no trials in which mom actually reappears. You know, in the first study, she never reappears after she goes behind a screen. So they get 0 trials experiencing that she will reappear behind the screen that she disappears behind, yet they expect her to do that in both of those conditions. I don't see a way to explain that by associative learning. But I agree with you that if all we had were the human infant experiments, we'd be in trouble. Because with only, first of all, with only human infant behavioral experiments, actually using neuroimaging, I think we can do a little better. But with only behavioral experiments, we run up against infants' very limited behavioral repertoire in the early months. And I don't think there's going to be any way to get around that in a behavioral experiment. But you can get around it by doing the same experiments on animals who are behaviorally more precocious, like chicks, or, well, almost any animal would be more precocious than a human infant in the first few months. So that's my answer to the associative learning account. But I think I've seriously misled you if you take me to be arguing that infants have extremely rich knowledge about the world. I think infants have pathetically lean knowledge about the world. The only things they know about are some of the deepest, most abstract properties that are true of every object out there, every person who moves around on their own, every set with an approximate numerical magnitude, and so forth, in the domains that I talked about. For every one of those domains, infants' ignorance is vast. They don't know. When people are reaching, they know that they have a goal, and they're intending to get to that goal, and that goal is perceptually accessible to them.
but they have no idea that the goal of a reach is going to be an object, right? That's something they have to learn. They have to learn almost everything. But they start out with these systems that single out the things that they're going to be learning about. And without those systems, I don't know how you make a learning account go forward. But this definitely turns on its head the view that babies start out with the world as a buzzing, blooming confusion. They start out sensing the world, but with no abstract understanding of its abstract properties. It says, no, there's a skeletal understanding of the abstract properties and no understanding of the sensory confusion. That they're going to have to learn about. Oh, and I don't make conclusions based on T.G.R. Bauer's experiments, for the record. Those have failed to replicate in many different labs.
Other questions?
I have one small one. Just where is time in your core knowledge?
Sorry?
In your core knowledge, where is time?
That's such a good question. There's very, very good reason to think that there are basic innate systems for representing time. And it comes from research on ants and bees. I don't know of any good research on humans, though, that can really get at this in the same way, because you have to do rather extreme things to see it, fly ants or bees from Boston to California, so they're jet lagged, and you can see what mechanisms they use to reorient themselves in time and things like that. But no, it's a wonderful area, and it's underexplored in infancy. I'd love to see more studies on that.
Other questions? Okay, if not, thank you so much, Liz, for the talk.
Thank you. It's not midnight yet, right?